In the grand theater of history, there are no simple villains, only convenient ones. The stories that endure are often not the most accurate, but the ones that provide the clearest target for our anger and our fear. We are told a simple story about the Great Depression in America. It is a tale of unchecked avarice on Wall Street, of speculators gambling with the nation's future, leading to the great stock market crash of 1929, and a decade of suffering. It is a narrative of cause and catastrophic effect. But what if that story, the one etched into our collective memory, is a profound and dangerous simplification? What if the crash wasn't the cause of the crisis, but rather a symptom of a deeper sickness, a desperate, convulsive reaction to a banking system that was already dying? Welcome to us Financial Market Dynamics today. We invite you to listen to the story and join us as we analyze and decode every specific detail, to question the accepted narrative and explore a more complex and perhaps more unsettling version of events. A version where the greatest economic collapse in modern history might not have been a failure of finance, but its horrifying last-ditch salvation. The official narrative begins with the Roaring Twenties, an era of unprecedented optimism and speculation. The textbook villain is the banking system, which supposedly inflated a massive stock market bubble through reckless margin lending. The story asserts that investors could buy stocks with as little as 10% down, borrowing the rest from banks in a frenzy of irrational exuberance. But let's apply a reverse lens to this accepted fact. Was this truly a case of predatory banks luring an innocent public into ruin? Or was it the other way around? The 1920s was a decade of profound technological and social change. The automobile, the radio, and electricity were transforming daily life. A wave of post-war optimism swept the nation, and for the first time, the stock market seemed accessible to the common person. The public demand for a piece of this perceived new prosperity was insatiable. In this context, were the banks the architects of the mania, or were they simply fulfilling a ravenous market demand? If a bank had refused to offer margin loans while its competitors were doing so, it would not have been hailed as prudent. It would have been driven out of business. The pressure to participate was immense, not just from shareholders, but from a public that demanded access to the get-rich-quick machine. The recklessness was not confined to Wall Street boardrooms. It was a national fever. Furthermore, the narrative of simple greed ignores the rigid, unforgiving cage in which the entire global financial system operated. The gold standard. Under this system, a bank's ability to lend was theoretically tied to its physical gold reserves. However, the economic expansion of the 1920s far outpaced the supply of gold. This created an impossible dilemma for bankers. To fuel the growth that everyone demanded, they had to find ways to stretch their reserves, to lend far more than their gold backing could safely support. It was not a choice born of pure avarice, but a structural imperative of the system itself. They were trapped. They had to either slam the brakes on the economy, triggering a recession that would be blamed on them, or keep lending and pray the system held together. They chose the latter, not necessarily as villains, but as actors in a tragedy where every path led to a dangerous outcome. The speculation in stocks, real estate in Florida, and agricultural loans in the Midwest, all cited as evidence of their recklessness, were symptoms of this same underlying disease. A desperate search for yield in a system constrained by an archaic monetary standard. By the summer of 1929, the sickness was reaching its terminal phase. The story we are told is that the banks were blissfully unaware of the coming storm. The reverse is true. The insiders knew the system was on the verge of collapse because their own balance sheets were screaming it. Secret meetings were held. Liquidity was drying up. The interest rates for overnight loans between banks were spiking. A clear sign of deep distrust. But what could they do? Imagine you are the head of a major bank in August 1929. You know your institution is technically insolvent, propped up only by public confidence and accounting tricks. If you publicly admit the truth, you don't just trigger a run on your bank. You trigger a run on every bank, collapsing the entire financial system in an instant. The choice was not between honesty and dishonesty. It was between silence and Armageddon. The reassurances published in the newspapers, often decried as propaganda, can be seen in another light, not as a malicious lie to trap small investors, but as a desperate collective attempt to talk the nation back from a ledge they knew they were standing on. It was a fragile tightrope walk, and they knew any sudden movement could prove fatal. The official story of Black Thursday, October 24, 1929, is one of sudden, inexplicable panic among small amateur investors. But this defies logic. Why would millions of individuals simultaneously decide to sell on that specific day? A more plausible yet darker theory presented is that major institutions began liquidating positions in a coordinated fashion. The narrative frames this as a deliberate act of sabotage, a controlled demolition. But let's reverse this perspective. What if it wasn't a coordinated plot but a stampede? Imagine a crowded theater where a few people in the front row smell smoke. They don't conspire to cause a panic. They simply, rationally, try to get to the exit first. Their movement alerts others who also begin to move. And in moments, a panicked, uncoordinated rush for the doors ensues. The coordinated selling of October 1929 may not have been a sinister plan, but the simultaneous reaction of large, informed players, all seeing the same terrifying data, and all trying to save themselves at the exact same time. The subsequent intervention by J.P. Morgan's consortium, often painted as a deceptive maneuver to sell their own stock to a gullible public, could also be viewed through a different lens. It was the same tactic Morgan had used to halt the panic of 1907. They were running a playbook from a previous crisis, a desperate attempt to restore order. The problem was that the financial world of 1929 was infinitely more leveraged and fragile than that of 1907. Their intervention was like using a bucket of water to stop a tidal wave. It only created a momentary pause before the true force of the collapse hit. The crash, therefore, wasn't the cause of the Great Depression. It was the public unveiling of a banking system that was already bankrupt. The $30 billion value that vanished didn't just disappear. It represented the evaporation of phantom wealth that was never really there to begin with. Wealth built on a mountain of unsustainable debt. For the major banks, the crash was not their downfall. It was their alibi. Every bad loan, every reckless decision made over the preceding decade could now be blamed on a single cataclysmic market event. Public attention shifted from the question, why were the banks so fragile, to why did the stock market crash? It was the perfect diversion, allowing the fundamental insolvency of the banking sector to be masked by the more dramatic spectacle of the stock market's collapse. The crisis they had dreaded in private had finally arrived in public, but in a form that deflected blame away from their own balance sheets. The years that followed, from 1930 to 1933, are often depicted as a period where the government and the Federal Reserve failed to act, allowing the crisis to spiral into a full-blown depression. The failure of 9-0 banks is presented as evidence of this incompetence. But what if this was not failure, but a deliberate, brutal policy of triage? The narrative claims that the big New York banks engineered the failure of their smaller rural competitors to consolidate power. Let's reverse this. The American banking system of 1929 was a chaotic patchwork of tens of thousands of small, poorly capitalized and unregulated local banks. Many were fundamentally unsound. When the deflationary wave hit, the Federal Reserve, led by the New York Fed, faced an impossible choice. Should it use its limited resources to try and save all 25-0 banks, likely failing and exhausting its own credibility in the process? Or should it focus its firepower on saving the largest money center banks, the core pillars of the system, in the hope that if the heart of the system survived, the rest could eventually be rebuilt? The decision to let smaller banks fail, seen as a predatory act, may have been a ruthless but pragmatic calculation. It wasn't about eliminating competition in a healthy market. It was about deciding which parts of a dying patient were salvageable. The consolidation that followed, with giants like Chase and National City Bank absorbing the assets of failed institutions, was not necessarily the goal of the policy, but its inevitable consequence. This process was formalized under President Hoover's Reconstruction Finance Corporation, RFC. The official story criticizes the RFC for directing the vast majority of its loans to the largest banks, This is framed as cronyism. But consider the alternative. In a systemic crisis, the goal is to prevent contagion. The failure of a single large bank could trigger a domino effect that brings down dozens of others. The failure of a small rural bank, while tragic for its community, poses a far smaller systemic risk. The RFC's strategy was akin to a battlefield medic focusing on the most critically wounded soldiers, who are also most vital to the army's structure. It was not a fair distribution of aid. It was a strategic allocation of resources designed to prevent total systemic collapse. The result was a banking landscape that was smaller, more concentrated, but arguably more stable than the fragmented system that had preceded it. Then came Franklin D. Roosevelt, taking office in the darkest hour of March 1933. His first act, the National Bank Holiday, is often portrayed as a move to give the banks a breather and allow them to reorganize, a measure for their benefit. But this misses the terror of the moment. The entire payment system of the United States had seized. People couldn't access their money. Commerce was grinding to a halt. The bank holiday was not a strategic pause. It was an emergency stop. Like pulling the brake on a runaway train just before it goes over a cliff, it halted the panic and gave the government a moment to impose order on chaos. The subsequent Emergency Banking Act, passed in a single day, gave the Treasury immense power to decide which banks would reopen. This is seen as the ultimate tool of the conspiracy, allowing the government to handpick winners and losers. But what was the alternative? Reopening all banks, including the ones known to be insolvent, would have immediately restarted the bank runs and destroyed the fragile confidence Roosevelt was trying to build. The classification of banks into A, B, and C categories was a brutal necessity. It was a rapid, wartime-like assessment of financial viability. The fact that larger banks were more likely to be deemed sound and allowed to reopen speaks less to a conspiracy and more to the fact that they had the resources, diversification, and access to Fed liquidity that smaller banks lacked. It was a confirmation of the pre-existing power structure, not the creation of a new one from scratch. Perhaps the most controversial act of this era was Roosevelt's Executive Order 6102, which effectively confiscated private gold holdings from American citizens. The standard narrative portrays this as an outright theft, a scheme to transfer wealth from the people to the banks. This interpretation, while emotionally powerful, ignores the economic prison of the gold standard. In a deflationary depression, prices and wages fall, but the value of debt remains fixed, making it harder and harder to repay. To break this spiral, the government needed to devalue the dollar and increase the money supply, essentially creating inflation. But under the gold standard, it couldn't do this. The dollar's value was fixed to gold. Confiscating the gold and revaluing it from $20.67 to $35 an ounce was a radical authoritarian move, but it was the only tool available to sever the link between the dollar and gold for domestic policy. This gave the Federal Reserve the ability to print money and inject desperately needed liquidity into the economy. The profit the government made wasn't squirreled away. It became the expanded reserve base that allowed the banking system to finally write off its bad loans and begin lending again. Was it fair to the gold holders? No. But was it a necessary evil to save the entire economy from a decade-long deflationary death spiral? From the perspective of a policymaker in 1933, it may have seemed like the only choice. Finally, we come to the landmark regulations of the New Deal, like the Glass-Steagall Act and the creation of the FDIC and SEC. The critical narrative argues these were designed by big banks to crush their smaller rivals with compliance costs and entrench their power. But let's look at the problems they were designed to solve. Glass-Steagall, which separated commercial and investment banking, was a direct response to the public outrage over banks gambling with depositor funds. The FDIC, which insures deposits, was created to solve the most fundamental problem of all, bank runs. Before FDIC, any rumor could cause depositors to panic and pull their money, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of failure. After FDIC, that incentive disappeared. It restored faith in the system. The SEC was created to bring transparency and rules to a stock market that had operated like a private casino. Did these regulations have unintended consequences? Absolutely. The compliance costs did favor larger institutions with legal departments. The FDIC did create a moral hazard by removing the need for depositors to monitor their bank's behavior. But to argue that their primary purpose was to create a cartel is to ignore the very real, very terrifying problems they were intended to fix. They were imperfect solutions to an unprecedented crisis. So, what is the new truth that emerges from this reverse analysis? The Great Depression was not a simple morality play of greedy bankers versus an innocent public. It was a systemic failure of a global financial architecture, the gold standard, which had become too rigid and fragile for the modern industrial world. The bankers of the 1920s were not masterminds plotting a collapse. They were participants in a bubble, trapped between the public's demand for endless growth and a monetary system that made that growth inherently unstable. The crash was not a controlled demolition. It was an uncontrolled avalanche, and the government's response, from Hoover to Roosevelt, was not a finely tuned conspiracy to consolidate power, but a series of desperate, often brutal, improvisations to prevent the utter disintegration of the American economy. The consolidation of the banking industry was not the secret goal of these policies. It was the unavoidable outcome of a crisis that wiped out the weakest players and a government response that prioritized systemic survival over the fate of individual institutions. The parallels drawn to 2008 and 2020 in the original narrative are correct, but perhaps for the wrong reason. The pattern is not one of repeating conspiracy, but of repeating dilemmas. In 2008, when faced with the collapse of institutions like Bear Stearns and Agee, policymakers were not gleefully plotting to make J.P. Morgan bigger. They were staring into the abyss of a complete global financial meltdown and making the same brutal triage decisions their predecessors made in the 1930s. Save the core of the system at all costs. The Dodd-Frank Act, like Glass-Steagall, was a flawed but genuine attempt to address the perceived causes of the crisis. The lesson from history is not that crises are manufactured by a powerful cabal. The more terrifying lesson is that our complex financial systems have an innate tendency toward fragility and collapse. And when they do, the responses available to us are almost always messy, unfair, and lead to greater concentration of power. This is not because of malice, but because in a storm of that magnitude, only the largest ships have a chance of staying afloat. And so, in the end, the story we tell ourselves about the Great Depression matters. If we believe it was a simple tale of Wall Street villains, we learn only to mistrust bankers. But if we see it as a systemic failure, a perfect storm of public mania, flawed monetary policy, and political desperation, we learn a deeper and more urgent lesson. We learn that stability is fragile, that seemingly rational choices can lead to collective disaster, and that in the face of a true systemic crisis, there are no clean solutions, only painful trade-offs. The ghosts of 1929 do not warn us of a secret plot being hatched in a boardroom. They warn us that the systems we build to create prosperity can also contain the seeds of their own destruction. This video analyzes historical economic cycles and current indicators for educational purposes, not financial investment advice. Please consult a professional before making investment decisions. If you enjoyed listening to the story, please press like, share this video, and leave a comment with your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the US Financial Market Dynamics channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any new videos.